Hello students, welcome to MOOC Political Economy 1. The topic for today's discussion is globalization, NGOs and development. Let us begin with a fundamental question. What is globalization? There is an interesting book by Deepak Nair and Amit Bhaduri called The Intelligent Person's Guide to Liberalization, where the authors say that liberalization, globalization, and privatization are all euphemistic expressions celebrating the high noon of capitalism. So when we are talking of globalization in contemporary world, we are basically referring to the ascendancy of capitalism as a global phenomenon. And in that phenomenon, it is commonplace to identify the concept of a borderless world. That means distances are becoming irrelevant. Globalization is thus the emergence of a complex web of interconnectedness. That means that our lives are increasingly shaped by events that occur and decisions that are made at a great distance from us. The central feature of globalization is, therefore, that geographical distances are of declining importance and that territorial boundaries, such as those between states, are becoming less significant. Many historians have noticed that the years spanning the two world wars and were an interruption of the upward trends in the expansion of world trade and investment, and that it is possible to interpret the post-war liberalization of trade and investment flows as leading to a resumption of those trends that were already discernible prior to the Second World War. In fact, if you try to understand the concept of globalization, you will see that it is not a new phenomenon as such. One could see the quintessence of globalization unfolding even in the times of Alexander the Great when he was trying to expand the frontiers of the Macedonian Empire. But the point is that contemporary globalization operates in a post-socialist world, and that is important to be kept in mind. The earlier integration of the world economy was driven more by technological changes in transport and communications than by policy changes. By contrast, today's most dramatic changes is the degree to which governments have intervened to reduce obstacles to the flow of trade and investments worldwide. The story of contemporary globalization is therefore to be written in two inks, one colored by technological changes and the other colored by state action. So this is what is important for us to consider, that unlike in earlier phases of globalization, when we see that it was primarily driven by technology, in today's world, states are also playing an important role in accommodating themselves to the concept of globalization. By no means, however, does globalization imply that the local and the national are subordinate to the global. Rather, what we have to keep in mind is that there has been a deepening as well as a broadening of the political process, in the sense that the local, national, and global events continuously mingle and interact. And therefore, we can refer to certain distinctive forms or manifestations of globalization which we need to keep in mind in order to appreciate the outcomes of the process. At the economic level, we see that globalization is reflected in the idea that no national economy is an island. All economies in the world today have, to a greater or lesser extent, been absorbed into an interlocking global economy. Globalization has therefore been defined as a shift from a world of distinct national economy to a global economy in which production is internationalized and financial capital flows freely and instantly between countries. Patterns of worldwide trade, finance, and production are creating global markets, and in the process, a single global capitalist economy has emerged. One of the key implications of this economic globalization is the reduced capacity of national governments to manage their economies, and in particular to resist their restricting along free market lines. In fact, if you try to understand the concept of economic globalization, you will see that the discretion of individual states have got somewhat redefined, because today we have moved into an age of multilateral governance, where at the economic level we see that the triumvirate of the Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, the World Bank and the IMF, call the central tunes to which all countries across the world have to play second fiddle. There is also cultural globalization, which is the process whereby information, commodities, and images that have been produced in one part of the world enter into a global flow that tends to flatten out cultural differences between nations, regions, and individuals. This has sometimes been portrayed as a process of McDonaldization or Coca-colonization. Driven in part by the growth of transnational companies and emergence of global commodities, cultural globalization is also fueled by the so-called information revolution through the spread of satellite communication, telecommunication networks, information technology, and of course the internet. Alongside cultural globalization, we see political globalization, which is evident in the growing importance of international organizations. These organizations are transnational in the sense that they exercise jurisdiction not within a single state, but within an international arena, comprising several states. Most prominent of such organizations in the post-1945 period are the United Nations, the NATO, the European Union, the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO, which we have just referred. There are other facets of globalization also. The military globalization, for instance, is discernible in the global arms trade, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the growth of transnational terrorism, and the growing significance of transnational military corporations. The discourse of global insecurity also points to the existence of a global military order. So we are not really thinking of a borderless world in the strict sense of the term when we are referring to globalization. There is also globalization in law, and this is seen in the expansion of transnational and international law pertaining to a range of issues from human rights alongside the creation of new world legal institutions such as the International Criminal Court. All these are indicative of an emerging global legal order. Ecological globalization consists in the creation of multilateral responses and regimes of global environmental governance. A shared ecology involves shared environmental problems from global warming to species protection. In fact, we are sensitive to the reality that climate change is a major issue staring all states on their faces. And states have realized that in the emerging order of the world today, no state is in a position to handle these problems single-handedly. And that is why globalization has also in some sense contributed to a borderless world where states have to hold hands across their borders in order to address problems staring at humanity. And that is why it makes sense to talk of social globalization, which is manifesting itself in shifting patterns of migration from south to north and east to west. These have turned migration and such issues into major global issues. But why is globalization a deeply controversial issue? While most governments and mainstream political parties are anxious to position themselves to take advantage of the benefits of globalization, an anti-globalization movement has also emerged simultaneously and most strongly, not only in the developed states, but also to some extent in the developing states also. There is, in a sense, a pro versus anti-globalization debate which is unfolding, and this is basically nothing more than a reworking of the older and more familiar ideological divide between capitalism and socialism. This is because the interconnectedness which lies at the heart of globalization is invariably linked to the extension of market exchange and commercial practices. Globalization thus has a pronounced neoliberal or a free market ideological character, and we see that states are more and more being alienated from markets which are being accorded increasing levels of independence. So the main issue about globalization is capitalism. Capitalism, in short, remains at the heart of globalization. Supporters of globalization, sometimes called globalists but also referred to as the hyper-globalists, usually argue that capitalism tends towards specific prosperity and widening opportunity, in which case global capitalism, with inequality and exploitation, will simply generate inevitably new forms of misery and injustice. In one important respect, however, the globalization debate is new, and this is something I've harped on a moment ago, and that is it unfolds in a post-socialist framework that no longer recognizes that there are viable alternatives to the market structure and capitalist organization, and all this subsequent to the demise of the erstwhile USSR in the 1990s. The choice is therefore very clearly before the world between neoliberal globalization and regulated globalization, rather than between global capitalism and any qualitatively different alternative. So what are the arguments that we see in favor of globalization? The positivists draw attention to the potential of stretched social relations which tend to improve the quality of life. They also raise living standards and bring people together, which in turn promotes harmony, sharing of cultures, understanding among nations and peoples across the world. In that sense, the whole idea of globalization approximates the concept of a global village. But the pessimistic globalists argue that the world is becoming less diverse and more homogeneous. They harp on the dominance of major economic and political interests, particularly in the countries of the North like the US, Western Europe, and Japan, who are able effectively to resist all pressures for change and can impose their own agenda on the world. They see the diminution of national identities and sovereignty negatively and point to the uneven consequences of globalization. Because we have to understand that globalization is a process that does not unfold over a level playing field, and I'd be reiterating this, and it is therefore quite natural to understand that the rewards of globalization are not wielded by all segments of the population. There are unmistakably losers and winners. That is why the globalization debate focuses on specific groups such as women and unskilled manual workers who are major victims of globalization. And therefore, it is very important to understand that the state emerges in this context as a manager of globalization. Because I have already told you that globalization in today's world is not only technology-driven, it is also state-driven. The state is an important usherer of globalization. Although in a system which embraces world capitalism, there is an inherent tendency of the rich nations to get richer and the poorer nations to get poorer, it is important to understand, as globalists argue, in most cases, the poor nations get less poor if they set sail to the winds of globalization. In this view, the only parts of the world that fail to benefit from the process of globalization are those that choose to remain outside it. Globalization, therefore, must be managed so that its fundamentally benign effects are ensured and reinforced. Without this wise management, globalization stands to get imperiled. This management will be better and more effective if governments, international institutions, corporations, and intellectuals who celebrate and reinforce globalization join hands with the non-governmental organizations that generally discount and oppose it, creating a partnership and achieving what I call, as Jagdish Bhagwati pointed out, a shared success. So obviously globalization will have its vicissitudes, but it is up to states to ensure that they are able to address the needs of those sections of the population who are unable to take advantage of the effects of globalization. And it is in this context that non-governmental organizations can go a long way in empowerment of people who are not able to take advantage of the opportunities unleashed by globalization. The positive aspects of globalization can hardly be overlooked. Opening up to international trade has helped many countries to grow at a much faster rate than would have been possible otherwise. International trade aids economic development when a country's exports drive its economic growth. In fact, export-led growth was the centerpiece of the industrial policy that enriched much of Asia and improved the plight of millions of people in this large continent. Globalization has also reduced the sense of isolation felt in much of the developing world and has given many people in the developing world the opportunity to gain access to knowledge well beyond the reach of even the wealthiest in any country a century ago. But the interesting question is, what are the problems emanating from globalization? While there are advantages, we can hardly turn a blind eye to the problems. Despite its professed advantages and benefits, it would be a fallacy to consider that development and progress are coterminous with globalization. In fact, to many in the developing world, there has been a widening gulf between promise and performance. A growing divide, as Stiglitz notes, between the haves and the have-nots has left increasing numbers in the third world in dire poverty, often living on less than $1 a day. Globalization has therefore been criticized because of its tendency towards risks, uncertainty, and instability. With intensification of capitalism, there is also intensification of individualism and social isolationism. Globalization has therefore been associated with increased risk and uncertainty in at least three ways. First, global financial markets that are inherently unstable increasingly influence economic decision making. This is because much of their activity is speculative and they are driven by short-term economic considerations. The fate of companies, industries, national economies, and even regions of the world is therefore subject to the whims of the financial market. There are other perils of globalization also. It ushers in, among other things, a risk society, one that is characterized by rising individualism and an associated weakening of tradition, community, and established institutions, which is why many look upon globalization as a threat to their cultural identity. A third form of instability is the alleged tendency of globalization towards environmental crisis and destruction. Eco-sociologists explain this by reference to capitalism's relentless, blind, obsessive concern with profits and its consequently insensitivity towards ecological issues. By spreading materialism and entrenching absolute faith in science and technology, industrialism undermines human values and deadens sensibilities. Reformist ecologists therefore make a clarion call for global environmental protection. Therefore, the solution lies in embeddedness. We cannot pursue the interests of capitalism or pursue the goal of high profit making at the risk of jeopardizing fundamental interests of human society. Panich observes that the main agenda of the neoliberal ideology trumpeting the cause of the untrammeled financial speculation, export competition, and capital accumulation, in short, of globalization has been to free markets from states. Embeddedness seems to therefore have become the new catchword. As long as markets are embedded in society, they can be prudent and efficient and just. In other words, this connect with society should not be abandoned under any circumstance. And that is what embeddedness is trying to draw attention to. Hence, the concern of the opponents of neoliberalism for strengthening the role of the state vis-à-vis markets. The state ought to have its feet firmly planted on the bedrock of social interest that is embedded in society and concerns of broader societal interests. And that is where the role of non-governmental organizations particularly become relevant. One must understand, as I have also highlighted earlier, that globalization does not operate over a level playing field. Therefore, the consequences are disparate for different segments of the population. Economists hypothesize that the growing income inequality in the industrial countries will generate political effects in the form of greater protectionism or even severe social disruption. Yet, the theories linking these economic and political outcomes are either unstated or underdeveloped. In particular, little attention is given to the role of domestic political and economic institutions in channeling the effects of trade and economic changes like the introduction of new technologies within particular societies. Given the wide variance in the levels of social disruption like strikes, riots, and so on, among countries that are similarly exposed to international trade, it appears that domestic institutional variables must loom large in the story of globalization. So therefore, in appreciating the role of the non-governmental organizations, one must understand as to who are the losers in the process of globalization. And those that are bypassed by the process or efforts at development need to be considered. The dominant liberal capitalist international integration and the New World Order have been good for only some people and some countries. Naturally, the poor, the marginalized, the unskilled, the minorities, and the working classes are the new anti-globalizers, and these losers of globalization can broadly be categorized into three domains. The first refers to the poor and the developing nations and the poor and the marginalized people living in them. The second is civil society organizations and groups, NGOs, and various other advocacy networks. They are often seen to be working in partnership with the UN and other international agencies, seeking to address various fundamental problems threatening life like hunger, disease, deprivation, destitution, discrimination, torture, gender discrimination the world over. The third category relates to the marginalized, unemployed, and the unemployable youth, who are the working poor, victims of racial discrimination and social class privilege in the affluent countries in the West. So even the West is not free from these perils of globalization. To these must be added the passionate dissenters, various empowerment groups, and above all, a number of perceptive thinkers and public figures who are deeply concerned about the excesses of the liberal capitalist West abroad. In view of the condition of all these losers of globalization, it is important that they are given a fair treatment by the state. They can surely not be looked upon as casualties of civilization. And to sensitize the state and governments in countries across the world about those sections who tend to lose out in the race of globalization, the NGOs can have a very prominent role to play. The advance of globalization and the progressive deterritorialization of economic, cultural, and political life has gradually weakened the idea that society should be understood merely in domestic or national terms. A perhaps fruitful way of thinking about the transnational dimension of society is what is called a global society or a global civil society, which we see in the world today. Interest in the idea of a global civil society grew during the 1990s as a mosaic of new groups, organizations, and movements which started to appear and which both sought to challenge or resist what was seen as corporate globalization and articulate alternative models of social, economic, and political development. The growth of such groups has also been facilitated by the emergence of a framework of global governance, which has both provided civil society groups with resources of funding and given them the opportunity to engage in policy formulation and sometimes even policy implementation. The interesting question before us now is there a global civil society? The so-called Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 is often cited as the earliest evidence of a functioning global civil society, where people have come together bonded by awareness of common problems, as that in the case of environment, which threatens countries across the world today. The formation of the World Social Forum in 2001 gave the global civil society sector a greater sense of focus and organizational direction, enabling it thereby to challenge its greatest capitalist rival, the World Economic Forum. In this sense, the global civil society has emerged as a third force between transnational corporations and international organizations representing neither the market nor the state, but displaying an undeniable interconnectedness among people across the world who feel threatened by similar problems as environment and terrorism. However, the concept of a global society remains controversial. Participation in a global civil society, for instance, is restricted to a relatively small number of people. None of its groups yet constitutes a genuine mass movement, comparable, say, to the trade union movement or to the mass membership of political parties of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Moreover, there are doubts about the degree of interconnectedness, although interconnectedness is definitely there, within global civil society. Is it one thing or is it a number of things? In particular, there are differences between the two main actors within global civil society, the transnational social movements and the non-governmental organizations. Transnational social movements, sometimes called new social movements, developed during the 1960s and the 1970s against the backdrop of growing student unrest in the United States, anti-Vietnam War protests, and the rise of countercultural attitudes and sensibilities. Key examples included the women's movement, the environmental or the green movement, and the peace movement. These movements attracted the young, the better educated, and the relatively affluent, and typically embraced a post-materialist ethic. They tended to be more concerned with the quality of life issues and the cultural change than with social advancement in the traditional sense. Such tendencies were accentuated by the development from the 1990s onwards of a new wave of social movement activism, with the emergence of what has been variously called anti-globalization, anti-capitalist, anti-corporatist movements, or simply global justice movements. But definitely, NGOs are the key actors within this global civil society. As such, transnational social movements represent the outsider face of global civil society. Their outsider status is largely a result of the nature of their ideological and political goals, which are radical rather than mainstream, and are therefore generally incompatible with those of conventional policymakers at both national and global levels. Many, nevertheless, view non-governmental organizations, NGOs for short, as the key actors within global civil society, their advantage being that they are institutionalized and professionalized insiders. There can therefore be little doubt about the major international NGOs and the NGO sector as a whole, which constitutes a new significant group of political actors on the global stage. Because it is these non-governmental organizations operating at various levels from the grassroots upwards who sensitize the governments in various countries about the needs and the problems and the dilemmas and the difficulties of different sections of the people who have not been able to reap sufficient mileage from the advantages of globalization. So how is it that NGOs have emerged as the key actors in a global civil society? Advocacy NGOs have had a variety of high-profile successes, often constraining the influence of TNCs and altering the policy direction of national governments and international organizations. NGO pressure during the UN's Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 contributed to a treaty to control the emission of greenhouse gases, about which we all seem to be conscious today. So the contribution of NGOs can easily be felt. The international campaign to ban landmines, against which even Lady Diana had worked relentlessly, is a network of more than 14,000 NGOs working in 90 countries, was effective in 1997 in getting the agreement of some 120 states to ban the production, use, and stockpiling of anti-personnel landmines. The multilateral agreement on investment, negotiated by the OECD and aimed at liberalizing foreign investment and reducing domestic regulation, was pushed off the political agenda by a sustained NGO campaign. So all these bear testimony to the tremendous role that NGOs have been playing in order to ensure that the positive effects of development and progress emanating from globalization percolate to all and sundry. NGOs have also acted as key policymakers and implementers. As NGOs have accepted as key policymakers, policy influencers, and even policy implementators, they have developed into tamed social movements. The price for their participation in the process of global governance has been the adoption of more mainstream or responsible policy positions. This trend is reflected in the fact that the distinctions between NGOs and governments and international organizations and between NGOs and TNCs have become increasingly blurred. Not only do NGOs have formal rights of consultation with international organizations being accepted as a source of specialist advice and information, but NGOs and international organizations will often work together in formulating and carrying out a range of humanitarian projects. In fact, NGOs have been found to indulge in research on a worldwide scale, which brings to light vital inputs for policymaking. So what are the advantages of a global civil society? A global civil society mainly has two advantages. First, it provides a necessary counterbalance to corporate power. Until the 1990s, the advance of TNCs met little effective resistance, meaning that international organizations in particular fell too easily under the sway of a neoliberal agenda committed to free markets and free trade. Transnational social movements and NGOs help to ensure that such interests and ideas are checked, challenged, and scrutinized, not necessarily to block corporate interests or inhibit economic globalization, but it acts as some kind of a filter to strengthen the global policy-making process by making more voices audible and available at the table. Second, emergent civil society is often seen as a form of fledgling democratic global politics. This has occurred because civil society bodies have articulated the interests of people and groups who have been disempowered by the globalization process, and that is why I have been harping again and again that globalization does not unfold over a level playing field. Similarly, by introducing an element of public scrutiny and accountability to the workings of international bodies, conferences, summits, and the like, global civil society functions as a channel of communication between the individual and global institutions. But there are criticisms that have been leveled against the emergent global society and the NGOs. What are they? In the first place, the democratic credentials of NGOs and, for that matter, social movements are questionable. For example, how can NGOs be in the forefront of a process of democratization when they are entirely non-elected and self-appointed bodies? Second, the tactics of popular activism and direct action so clearly associated with social movements in certain NGOs have also attracted criticism. For instance, the violence that has accompanied many major anti-capitalist protests, even in the West, has arguably alienated many potential supporters, giving the entire movement an image of recklessness and irresponsibility. A final criticism is that NGOs and social movements distort national and global political agendas through the fixation on gaining media attention, both as the principal means of exerting pressure and in order to attract support and funding. But despite these criticisms, the rising influence of civil society and NGOs can hardly be denied, and this is corroborated by the World Commission on the Social Dimension of Globalization, which takes note of and emphasizes the role of civil society organizations on governments. International public opinion has become a political power that is both commanding and unavoidable. In fact, the role of public opinion has achieved substance with the advent of globalization owing to the improvement of communications and the influx of new technologies, which technology has enabled citizens to develop greater awareness about the inequalities and problems throughout the land. And along with this awareness, their demands and expectations are also increasing, and they are bringing more and more pressure to bear on governments to establish a more democratic world. And these minor cases, which are apt to be lost sight of, gain attention because of the work that is done by NGOs across the world. A prominent example in India could be the Forest Rights Act, which was legislated by the Indian Parliament in 2006, and in this regard, the role of NGOs can hardly be exaggerated. In conclusion, we can say that globalization has dislocated traditional livelihoods and local communities, and it threatens environmental sustainability and cultural diversity. Despite its advantages, these perils cannot be overlooked. But it is only through continuous dialogue between civil society and the government that one can ensure that globalization does not in any way jeopardize national cultures and cultural diversities. It is imperative to incorporate the social dimension of globalization. The government ought to ensure that various groups be granted adequate representation at the governing level, and that civil societies be allowed to participate and assume their democratic responsibilities, because, as I have said again and again, globalization does not unfold over a level playing field. Therefore, there are gainers and there are losers, and the losers can't be wished away as casualties of civilization or the globalization process. It is therefore essential to generate a quality of openness through the repeated dissemination of information and to expand the indicators that charts the results of globalization. That way, we will be able to reap the advantages of globalization and bring the negativities to a minimum.